Obviously, there'll be an issue about what we use that line for. Melbourne's been very fortunate. It's had a very extensive radial rail network for a long period, but there was this genuine gap in parts of the west. What we didn't do for a lot of that rail network was actually electrify it, and we've been doing that as well. And we are really fortunate that this infill area in many ways is so close to the city. The other huge advantage we've got is that we actually have a serious comparative advantage in housing affordability. And one of the things that hasn't been talked about today, but if you listen to someone like Bernard Salt, he does this very well. There is still a suburban dream out there. And he did some work which he shared in another forum I was at in Melbourne, where he actually compared the cheapest house he could find in Blacktown with the cheapest house he could find in Melton, both of which are equivalent distances from the city. The data's from October 2008. The price in Blacktown was just under 400,000. The price at Melton was 250,000. We are actually able to offer the capacity for a lot of people to realise their dreams. That's been the vision we've sold to the Commonwealth. It's the integrated transport and land use vision.
Thanks, John. Look, within the constraints of 3 public sector guys in an open forum with lots of media in the room, I'm still going to try and get them to be a little controversial. There's a couple of topics underpin this. One is relationship between the government and the private sector in provision of transport infrastructure, etc., and maybe even in its management and operation. And secondly, the role between the federal and state. So let me just throw it out there, maybe first on the federal-state issue. And the presumption is, in my view, and as I've written about in the magazine today, get the sense that the golden era 18 months ago, when everyone was cheering, we've got this new spirit of federal-state relations, and it was going to wash over us. The federalism was a thing of the past, the Commonwealth put the states together, and in the presence of one of our patrons, Nick Greiner, I mean, that relationship that Bob Hawke and Nick Greiner forged to recast federalism in the 80s. Have we gone backwards or forwards? And because there's a fear that either the recession provided not enough money from the feds, which they were going to buy their way into the states retreating back into some of the tribalism. It's my city, Canberra, by the way, and don't tell me how to run it. From you guys on the ground, you can put the politics aside, are you seeing much difference? Is the world different 18 months on than it was back then, and is it looking better or worse going forward?
I think we've actually moved forward. I think one of the great things that's come out of this process, in the Infrastructure Australia process and the recent investment, is back to this focus on cities and the investment in urban transport. From my perspective, that is a big tick. And, if we want to see the success of our cities moving forward, sure, we need road infrastructure, no question, really support it. But we need a huge investment in passenger transport to support our growth areas. And, for us in Queensland, we need very quickly more heavy rail cross-city capacity. We need light rail transit. We need more investment in our busway network. And I must say, one of the great things out of this last round of investment was the recognition of passenger transport. And from my point of view, that's a big tick. I think the other thing is also the relationships with local government. I come from local government historically, and I still think that is an absolute powerhouse. When you get 3 levels of government supporting a particular project and putting money on the table, and for local government substantial money on the table, that is a good thing.
Les, you've got 45 local councils in Sydney. They're not quite as helpful, I'd imagine, as opposed to 1 in Brisbane. New South Wales didn't get the sort of money for public transport yet that we hope would flow on later. Where are you in the federal-state continuum at the moment?
Well, I think the relationship is fairly good, and strategically, when you have a look at transport issues and city developing issues, the reality is that transport's important at a local level, at a regional level, intrastate and nationally. And because you've got to deal with all of those 4 scenarios, you can't do it without a very strong involvement from the federal government. And they realise that. They're in a position where they can provide resources that the state government can't. The difficulty that we have in the relationship is how we go about prioritising that activity and what sort of information they need to make reasonable decisions. They have the advantage of a broader view than we've got. We need to spend a little bit more time understanding that. They need to spend a little bit more time getting into the detail of our problems. I agree with David that them getting involved in urban congestion issues is a big help. the relationship, you know, for the economic development of the country and our city is all about those sorts of issues. They have a significant impact on that. And, you know, given what's been happening in the last couple of years, I think I agree with David, it's more positive than negative.
John, we'll go back to you with questions on private investment. We're only 18 months back into a federal-state love-in, but we're 20 years into a public-private approach really to major transport infrastructure now. Current state, what are the good partnerships you've seen in a public-private mode, and what are the ones that have we had our druthers, we do a little differently? What have you learned of the process now as you go forth in embracing new private money?
Well, I think the first thing, and Victoria has shown this, is that you actually have to adapt a little to circumstances. We've accommodated, you know, perhaps a few more things that we might have done on a financing side over the last 12 months to get 3 deals up. But for all that, we remain very innovative. I mean, we were probably slow into the alliance market compared to, say, a Queensland, and we're now driving that pretty hard from the road space. We're probably driving that harder in a value for money sense, notwithstanding, you know, all that's taken place in the economic circumstances. You know, we've been fortunate in a road sense that the traffic risk hasn't affected us as much. We've been fortunate with really rail franchising, notwithstanding that we had a rail operator fall over 7 years ago. We've had a huge private sector involvement in basically operation and maintenance of the rail system. I mean, there are probably few bounds. I think a challenge for this sort of audience is, particularly for the infrastructure space, is that we actually have to continue to find the economic PPPs out there. Because otherwise, even if you say the money is sort of coming out of the property development incremental of value, or it's coming out of transport some ways, if we put ourselves simply up against social PPPs, we do slip back in a consideration in the government mind. And one of the challenges is we've actually got to get a significant economic PPP user pays component continue into projects, because that does change the dynamics of how those projects are considered in government.
Dave, what's this room doing to help you change the culture, the great socialist state of Queensland approach, regardless of government? It's had a less warm embrace of private sector. That's changing now. What can they do? What's business practice on a private sector sense that encourages that trend to come even further?
I think there's two things. You know, there's nothing like delivery. And I think getting out there, and I think we heard from some of the speakers this morning that one of the great things is actually get out there and deliver those services to the community, whether it's by providing, you know, roads, toll roads, opportunities, options, schools, hospitals, whatever. I think that the key thing is, look, let's move it along, let's get out there, let's do the job that the community expects us to do. I think the other interesting thing I always sit back in a little bit of amusement is watching the wrangles between private sector organisations in their own right. And you know, we talk about the need to deliver some great economic infrastructure. I think there's always, you know, I think sometimes the government, and we're always criticised for being a bit slow, but I think sometimes the private sector in its own dealings in delivering economic infrastructure, and I'm looking at the coalfields, is actually pretty cautious in its own right. And sometimes I think, you know, we really just need to get on with it.
Les, lastly, you've got a hell of a project out there in Sydney Metro, one that the proponent as government has changed a few times, and one that the opposition is threatening to shut down if they win. So it's the perfect certainty environment to deliver a major infrastructure project. That notwithstanding, you appear to have had some pretty good private sector interest. What's the latest? I know you've just announced a short list for one stage of the project. Where are you up? Where are you up to?
A short list has been announced for the permanent route infrastructure, which is the civil engineering work associated with it.
The dig.
The dig and the concrete tunnel, etc. And the integrated metro operations is at the second stage. Now,
is there as much interest in running it as there is in building it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, big infrastructure projects like that start to make sense when you understand the big picture, when